Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Online Warriors podcast. My name is Nerd Bomber.
And I'm Tactic.
And we're here wishing you all a very happy 4th of July if you guys are located in the United States. If you're in Canada, I believe Canada Independence Day is also this week. And wherever you are around the world, hopefully you're having a wonderful week. Because it is a holiday for us this week, we're going to be bringing back kind of an old interview, but a really good one. We'll be replaying the interview with Daniel Greenberg, who is professor of game design at George Mason University and the founder of Winterion Game Studios. You'll also hear a wonderful voice from the past, Illegal 86.
Wow.
So we know how much you guys were all missing hearing his wonderful voice every week, and never fear, he is back in this replay episode.
My impressions just weren't cutting it.
No. And we would be remiss if we didn't thank Stephen Keller and Lloyd Weldy for their fantastic patronage. They are our producers of the week, and we thank you both. Without further ado, let's get into the interview.
Daniel Greenberg is joining us from George Mason University, where he teaches game design topics in the computer game design program, focusing on history and analysis. So we're hoping to have a great conversation with him today. Daniel, how you doing?
Terrific. Thank you for having me on.
It is our pleasure to have you. And yeah, looking forward to kind of diving into this is nominally a gaming podcast, I think. So we have a lot of questions, and I'm pretty sure you have a lot of answers. So to lead things off, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got your start in game design academia?
Yeah, sure. So like most people in this sphere, obviously I have a history of playing these things growing up. Not to date myself, but the first two things I had in the house were a 2600 and a Commodore 64. So I've kind of been inundated this stuff from the get-go. What got me started in game design academia actually was, in addition to being a video game professor, I work as a programmer for the federal sector. I do a lot of work for, U.S. Postal Service, Department of Justice, Health and Human Services. And my degrees were originally in that sort of, I guess, what you might call like serious programming sphere. But I found myself in the labs at George Mason. I would be doing my homework. I'd be making an operating system from scratch or something like intellectually stimulating, but also kind of like mind-numbingly boring. And I'd look over and there were the game design students. And they were making these beautiful, models and rigs, and they really knew what they were doing, but they get stuck in a programming question. I'd go over, I'd help them with it, go back to my homework. They get stuck again, I go over, help them, go back to my homework. And after a while, I was like, they have much better homework than I do. So I actually switched my major from a straight computer science degree to a computer science degree with a concentration in game design. And when I came back to the university to work on a master's, instead of doing a master's of science, I did a master's of arts in computer game design and followed that through to graduate teaching assistant and finally all the way up to professor.
Well, I think I speak for all three of us. Obviously, super, super impressive. And again, super, super happy to have you on. I was at one point a part of the academic world myself, actually until very recently. So yeah, it can be a winding road. So I guess we can dive more now into video games, right?
So yeah, you mentioned that you were inundated with games as a kid. Did you ever think that video games and gaming would ever become the staple that it is in today's society?
I'll admit I'm still a little surprised by the financial side of things. Like the fact that games now pull in more per year than movies, books, sports, television, from a strictly financial standpoint, it's still a little surprising to me. I don't know that I'm not surprised that they are the cultural thing that they are, because every kid I knew in school growing up at least casually understood video games. There was sort of that divide between the kids in the 80s who knew it and played it, and at least understood what it was, and the parents who really didn't. It's not really surprising a generation, 2 generations later, those of us who have kids, those of us who are raising kids, we grew up with the stuff, so we kind of expect it, you understand it. Like culturally, it's no longer counterculture, so to speak. But I get surprised sometimes by the financial side of things, for sure.
At what point do you think gaming turned the corner from a fun sort of diversion to a true art form and storytelling medium?
I like to joke sometimes that we are so far past the point of arguing are games art, and now we're just arguing how good or bad the art is. I don't know that we ever really, it was hard to perceive it maybe at the time, right? Especially how commercial and how simple the stuff that most people knew, right? Your Space Invaders and Pac-Man games. People weren't playing the stuff that Muriel Tramis was making. People weren't seeing some of the really artistic stuff coming out of, especially internationally. France had an amazing PC scene in the 80s. So it's not always visible, but it's always been art. I think arguably the medium doesn't become art simply because it's recognized as such. We, as people, come to the realization that this creative medium that we're developing is itself the art. And I think maybe you say turning the corner from game to art. I think it's more that the people making games now feel comfortable enough to start tackling things that they maybe felt pressure not to do in the past, or felt like the toolkit was insufficient to express what they wanted to say. James Cameron says he wrote Avatar in high school, and I believe him when he says it, unobtainium and all.
Mm-hmm.
But he knew that he couldn't make it at the time. He didn't have the financial support to. His vision was so grand he couldn't really tackle it. So he made a bunch of other stuff first, and he did great. He made Terminator, he made Titanic. The guy's a legend in his field. But I do think there are some game designers who played it safe earlier on, or at least in order to make it in the industry, the stuff that really worked well, partially due to limited hardware, partially due to limits in software.
I mean, the coding side of things early on, that was a true art form because of the limitations in RAM. I mean, you hear time and time these stories of the clever stuff they did just because of disk space.
Oh, yeah. Like Nasir's assembly code is ridiculous. Anyone that's ever worked on stuff with him will praise up and down how good he was at writing code. Yeah, I mean, obviously the memory limitations, working with chipsets, and even the cost of chips, and trying to minify your code to the point where you're doing clever things like addressing memory and shifting memory simultaneously. That you're manipulating your counters simultaneous with like frame shifts, so that you're refreshing a frame on screen at the same time that you're toggling some in-game variable. Yeah, you have to really be creative when you're working with like a 4 kilobyte game versus a 400 megabyte game.
Yeah, we've come a long way. It's no news to anybody saying that, but yeah, I mean, I think it is true what you said. It has always been art. It's just when did we start perceiving it as that, and wasn't necessarily turning a corner? Maybe not so much. It's just maybe one day we all woke up and we're like, wow, these video games, they're. I mean, now we have games that they're akin to movies. They're designed like movies.
They want to be movies. They want very badly to be movies.
Right, and no one would argue, obviously, that movies aren't art. So at this point, like you said, the conversation is over as far as
and we've wanted that for a long time. My wife Alex and I are working on a film noir, game noir panel for MagFest in January, and one of the games we're watching to kind of get a picture for how games have tackled noir, comic noir, neo noir, whatever is Snatcher. And Snatcher wants very badly to be a movie. Most things Hideo Kojima makes want very badly to be movies, but
right. Yeah, I was actually going to bring him up. What was Death Stranding? Like the trailer for Death Stranding. I mean, not only did they put the Walking Dead guy in it, but yeah, it like you said, it wants to be a movie.
Yeah, you're right on. Like that's the difference, right? We're talking 1987 versus what was Death Stranding, 2018, 2019?
Yeah. I want to say 2019. I'm actually not sure. It's a good question. So,
I mean, we're huge gulf, right? 30 years of technology improving, and now all of the weapons you have at your disposal as a game designer versus the limitations that you had in that previous space, and the limitations will, necessity breeds the creativity there. You'll come up with some really clever ways to do things, but you're still kind of hamstrung, right? You have to the vision is compromised by what the medium will permit it to be. Now, when you have this sort of ridiculous freedom, the budget is the constraint, right? It's, do we have 5 years? Do we have, $100 million? What is the bandwidth that we have to do what we want to do in a way that before it was, can I even get this to work in the system of choice?
Well, and the other funny thing is, in a sense, we've come full circle now where I think before, a movie would come out and the studio or something would go to some game designer and say, hey, we need a game that is based on E.T. and you have a certain amount of time. And obviously that particular example was a disaster. But now it's turning into the reverse where a game comes out. And, admittedly, like 10 years later or something, television studios are saying we need a Halo TV show right now. Or HBO is saying we need a TV show based on The Last of Us, because games have attained that level of, story.
It's no longer can we, it's should we.
Right. And that's a fun subject for me because that kind of gets into my thesis. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of transmediation. Basically,
Can't say I am, no.
migrating something from one form to another. So the movie based on the book, the game based on the movie. It is when you take something from one art form and move it to another art form. And it's each has its own strengths and weaknesses, right? Books have this limitless creativity because your mind's responsible for filling in the audio visual cues for the descriptions you're reading. Movies can really wow you and impress you, but they're limited by you must accept the provided audiovisual presentation as the story, right? Because in that case, the film decides what the characters look like, what the characters sound like. When you're playing an RPG, if the RPG has voiceovers, that's what the characters sound like. If the RPG just has text, your mind will fill in what those characters sound like. And so even within a single medium, design decisions will go a long way in kind of influencing that experience. And I think from a transmediative standpoint, it's exciting to see games tackled this way because interactivity, and this is something Games Academia has known for like a long time. Games are really, really good at getting your attention. They're not always great at doing something with it once they have it. So the interactivity of games makes them really, really appealing and really, really connecting. And the games that succeed in capturing people's imaginations, the ones that really have evocative narratives and the elements of play reinforce those narratives. How well do they do when they try to shift to a medium that no longer has that advantage, right? That the viewer has to get involved and excited in the world without the advantage of the mechanics of the game, the play of the game, the flow that was designed. You have none of that numerology in your corner. You have to sell them entirely on plot, characters, visual, whatever. And it's challenging. It's not always easy to do. I think there's a reason video game movies in particular have had such a checkered isn't really even fair because that assumes 50%, such a fail rate amongst viewers is because it is difficult to give up that tool. And it's even more difficult to not recognize that the reason people are so engaged in a particular story, in a particular series, is in part because of those elements. Because, yeah, we do get invested in the plot and the characters, but some of that is subconscious. Some of that is subconscious because we get invested because the game does a good job of hooking us sufficiently that we become invested in those characters.
Right. So you're actually, there's a debate, as far as what element of a game is more important to its success, storytelling or gameplay mechanics. And you were kind of just talking about that dichotomy. Which side of that debate, where do you fall on that? To make a game good, what do you think is the more important thing?
I am personally someone that enjoys a good plot, but I think I'm wrong. I think, personally speaking, if you had to have one, give me a game that does something interesting versus a game that says something interesting, because a game that does something interesting is going to inspire 100 games, some of which will say something interesting. A good mechanic or a good genre definition will inspire so much creativity and gets you through a whole new way of playing. We have lots of ways of telling stories, right? We have 100 different media that we can use to tell stories. And I think games are a terrific one to do so. And a lot of my students want to tell stories. I think one of the more common things, I always ask a question at the beginning of every semester, why do you want to make games? And so many students say, they have a story they want to tell. They want to make people feel emotions and they want to influence people's feelings on subjects. And so there is a deep desire to use it as a method of conveyance. But I do think a mechanic has a much bigger, it's a bigger draw, bigger staying power, and that it can be a vehicle for much more than, say, a single story can be. A really well-told story may inspire, its own little avenue, but more often than not, it's really doing something compelling with a game that will become an opportunity to kind of expand outward. I'm very much a proponent of anything that is going to produce more, to kind of propagate. The developer of Bubble Bobble, Futsuko Mitsuji, MTJ, if I'm remembering correctly, has an amazing quote. It's a quote that I love. It's in if you ever get the Taito Legends, I think it's PlayStation 2. There's like a little DVD or video that's on there. And he says that, he wanted to make Bubble Bobble to bring couples into the arcade, to bring them closer together so they could play the game together. But that he went from being a developer to being a teacher because he decided he would rather plant trees than be a tree. That he realized that even though he enjoyed developing games, that he could do so much more long term that if he created game developers. And I think a game that inspires a mechanic or a game that inspires more creativity in its wake, to me, is more important, more interesting than a game that has a compelling narrative.
Right. I mean, the example that jumps to mind for me, and I don't know what the first person shooter was, but obviously whoever made that and whatever it was, the story was secondary to, like you said, kind of the far-reaching thing it did, which is establish an entire genre and establish what so much of the gaming world is today, which is first-person shooters that nominally the gameplay mechanics are often very similar, but they can tell sometimes pretty intense stories.
I know there were some first-person shooters in like universities in the 70s, but I think the first commercial one I actually really remember was Midi Maze, which was an Atari ST game that also came out for some other systems. Do you remember Faceball 2000?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so Faceball 2000 was basically either like a demake or remake or something. It was MIDI Maze for consoles. MIDI Maze was named as such because it used the MIDI port to like link up multiple machines. It was actually not online, but it was a local multiplayer shooter where you played as these little, note, big round smiley sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
And because it used the MIDI port, that was kind of why they themed it that way. And that's I think when I think of first person shooters, especially because they're like action oriented, very commonly multiplayer is a big chunk of it, if not like the most famous, except for like your really narrative dive, like Wolfenstein, Doom type games. A lot of those first person shooters, I think of them as multiplayer experiences. So MIDI Maze is usually the first one I go to.
Yeah, even within that genre, there is a pretty broad spectrum of games that care about story, and then some games that are like, okay, we know that people aren't coming to these for story; they're coming to these for really solid first person shooter gameplay mechanics. But I think of like Call of Duty, I feel like took a turn where their stories turned into blockbuster movies.
Yeah, another example of game that want to be a movie. And another example, I guess you say, of games that know necessarily that that's not why they're there, or are, they're willing to back burner it. One of the most brilliant examples of that, one of my favorite examples of that, is Doom 2016. Right? Doom 2016 was so aware of how players may play it, that they may want to consume the plot, but that Doom guy by his design is so ruthlessly, efficiently violent just because of the way people play Doom, that you're capable of literally ripping the plot off the wall and smashing it if you want. Like, the game is designed to allow you to just, blow up cutscenes, that are in monitors, or kind of, just stampede your way through the game, almost completely devoid of the story if you want to, or, for players that want to consume it, they're welcome to, stay there and watch it.
Well, I mean, amongst all of the different genres of games, regardless of the mechanics, I feel like there's always certain game design elements that are kind of the underpinnings of video games as a whole. And what do you think are the main game design elements that make up a really good game and make up some of the most memorable games that have really helped to like advance the medium forward? I
think games, typically you have some sort of avatar or protagonist you're playing as, whether it's an ensemble thing like Final Fantasy VI or, an individualized game. You are taking on these roles, and these characters are defined by how they act, but also what you can do with them, right? Mario and Sonic, Mario is leaning backwards in a lot of his promo pictures. He's kind of going up. It's vertical. It's a very jump-based, methodical platforming. Sonic is leaning forward. He's got his arms out. It's a very horizontal, speed-oriented platforming. They're very similar games, but they play very, very differently, and they inspire different interests, different groups, different audiences. I think to be an effective game in your genre, or to really kind of sell what you're doing, it's a game that gets people sucked into the role. It is fun to set yourself aside for a little bit and be blah. There's exceptions to that, non-narrative games. I think of stuff from, as far back as Tetris to as recent as like Super Hexagon, games that are very explicitly tight core experiences around one sort of mechanic that is a fun, almost addicting mechanic. Puzzle games, very, very common genre for that. But a lot of other genres, a lot of other games rely upon you enjoying the experience of being this other character. Even if you don't necessarily relate to them, you don't put the controller down and go, gosh, I wish I was Bubsy. But you do enjoy the experience because the verbs that have been defined for that character, the level design that they've put them in, that mesh of layout, your character's abilities. It all kind of flows nicely. One of the first games we did for the channel was the original Ninja Gaiden. Again, speaking of games that want to be movie, Tecmo Theater, having all those cutscenes and kind of the presentation of the game.
Mhm.
But Ryu Hayabusa he's not easy to control, but once you understand how to do it, there's sort of a really elegant flow to the way that the level layout is and which ninjutsu abilities you can get, where you can get them. Richard did a bang up job, like mastering that game so he could actually beat it for the channel. And it's not easy, but what the game asks of you and how it is laid out, it is really well designed. And I think those are the games that people go back to or people look at and they understand that, okay, the design choices that were made, the way the levels are laid out, the way the power-ups are set up, the way checkpoints are placed, what the character's allowed to do. Okay, I see why I'm not allowed to slide in this game because that would invalidate or it kind of ruins these puzzles or these levels. I like games that think about how far can your character jump? How wide do those pits need to be to make them? Where are the landing zones? How engaging or safe is that stuff? It gets into minutia, right? And that's design. If you are a painter, pointillism is about, choosing your colors wisely and understanding how the interoperability of those colors, at closer range, at farther range, perception wise, kind of bleed into this beautiful picture. If you are, doing sumi-e and you have to think about, the pressure in your brush strokes and what that's going to leave you on paper or on canvas. If you are a musician and, your composition is every bit as important, right, as the play you make. It really is understanding the interaction of those various elements of design. To me, a game that stands the test time, a game that is important, a game that is seminal to games as a medium, is one in which those things kind of they all come together. The games, you always read reviews for games that are 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, whatever. They all tend to follow a similar pattern. They say this stuff works so well together, and that's when you're playing a game and the different disparate elements that have been developed by people are done consciously and in such a way that they work with each other, that they complement each other. They're greater than the sum of their parts. Those are the games that matter. Those are the ones that you'll really kind of come back to again and again when you're researching.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that definitely tracks too, because all of the games that really stand out to me as the ones that I kind of put in my top 10 list of all time have that cohesive element where everything comes together to just paint that one beautiful gaming picture. Now, you mentioned a few times your channel, and you're the founder of Winterion Game Studios, and one of your projects is IONGAMING, where you play through retro games and then discuss kind of their ins and outs. How did you kind of decide to start that project, and how does that influence your academic teachings, and how does that draw influence from your teachings?
So this is, I guess I'll show my age a little bit again here. When I was working on my master's degree, I got permission from the university. I said, I'd like to do a short video series explaining to students what is difficulty. What do we, when we're talking about parallax scrolling, what does that really mean? How is that implemented? How do we do things like transforms, rotations? What does the look like when you're doing matrix math for that sort of stuff? Just a really simple like introductory series. And they gave me the green light. So I bought a couple $1,000s worth of equipment. I got an Adobe subscription. I was all set up to do all this recording of video of games and like take that video and move it into After Effects and pause it and point to stuff and describe stuff. And then the administration came over my head and said, no, we're actually not going to give you credit for that after all. I'm sorry, but I had already broken all the equipment out. I'd already used the equipment. Like I was going to get pennies on the dollar if I tried to return this stuff. So it's like, I have an entire recording studio at home now. What am I going to do with it? And one of my friends goes, well, you could, this is 2015, I think, like early 2015. He goes, we could do Let's Plays because I think they're not as popular as they were on YouTube now, obviously. But back then, I think they were a little more so. We could do Let's Plays. And showing my age, I immediately turned to go, well, what's a Let's Play? So now we've been doing that for, I guess, 6 years now. It's our 5th season's kind of been scuttled pretty hard by COVID. Obviously, we've been separated most of the time. We've gotten minimal time to kind of all get together at the studio here. But the idea behind IONGAMING was to have a Let's Play channel where it was sort of a 2-dimensional look on games. What I mean by that is if you were interested in just Let's Plays, you could watch all like just the IONGAMING episodes. If you were interested in just academic panel lectures, you could watch all of our academic panel lectures because I'll go to, MagFest, Too Many Games, Retro World Expo, Gamer Grace out in Chicago. So we'll get invited, we'll do these talks either online or in person. And we've been doing that for years. So that's like one section of it. And then we try to, and we're a little behind on this. The idea was at the end of every Let's Play, we do a review episode. And the review episode talks about the game, why it matters, our experiences playing it. It's sort of like a 30-minute to an hour sort of to just put a bow on that individual Let's Play. Or if you're interested in a specific game or a genre game, you could just watch all of the, those. So like I want to watch the whole Secret of Mana series from first episode to last episode, and then the review, and then the bonus episodes and all the other content. So if you're interested in a game, you could get all the content for that game. If you're interested in a type of content, you can watch that kind of content for all the different games. So that was sort of the inspiration, was to do sort of a 2D style layout to the channel. I don't know that the videos are always reflective of my academic teaching style. The lecture panel videos certainly are. I plan out most of those. The ones that I spearhead are certainly designed the way I would design lecture topics. The panels that I've sat on with other people, I'd argue that my cadence and sort of the way I go about justifying things I talk on are, again, very similar to the academic teaching style. But the games themselves, when we sit and play the games, I'm not trying to do an academic lecture there. There, I'm trying to capture the experience of what it's like to be on the couch with friends playing that game. Because I think there is something to it. I think Let's Plays, besides being transformative, as in like each performance of a game, each person playing the game plays a little differently. You get a slightly different experience the same way you would like actors, theater, stage. 100 different theater companies can all perform the Scottish play. They're going to get slightly different versions out of it. You're going to get slightly different performances, better, worse, whatever. I think there's something valuable to the experience of play for a game, because there is something transformative about watching a Let's Play and the tone, the tenor of like the attitude of the people playing it, the way they play the game, versus a long play where there's sort of this silent, methodical intent to a long play. And they're less transformative, arguably, I guess, both from a legal standpoint and also sort of the perceptive one. That I think the Let's Plays are valuable in that they add something you're not getting from just experiencing the game independently.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, getting someone else's perspective, like you said, everybody experiences a game differently. And I think that's because, as we were talking about before, especially in a lot of the games where there's things open to interpretation, your brain fills in some of the blanks. So seeing someone else's interpretation of those blanks adds a little bit something to that game experience. One of the things that your channel focuses on, you guys do a lot of retro games. So as a big fan of retro games, what would you say are some must-play classics that you think everybody should play at least once?
So we mentioned Howard Scott Warshaw got a very brief mention earlier about E.T. Play E.T., but play with the instruction manual. I think there is something very valuable in seeing E.T. from the perspective of the challenge of making that game and the time frame it was made and the limitations of the system and the complexity of the game as written out in the instruction manual, and at least knowing what it is you need to do, and then try to play it. Because I have so many students who come in and say, I'm so excited to learn about video games. I hope you don't make us play E.T. That's the worst game ever made. Ha 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 ha. And it's, I don't really think it is. I don't even think it's the worst game on its own system. I think if I really dug through the 2600 library, I could probably find plenty of games that are worse than E.T. Maybe not as frustrating to play blindly, to walk in and play without knowing what you're doing, without reading on what you're doing. The expectation is a little different there. I mean, remember, this is the era that if you wanted to fire up a PC game, it would tell you, what is the fifth word on page 26, right, for their copy protection. There's just an expectation in that era that you're reading the material that comes with these titles, whether it's for copy protection purposes or understanding the game.
Yeah, I think players today, like, it's so different because now you get a game, especially I'm thinking like console games and even obviously PC games, now they're all digital. You don't get that manual with games anymore, but that used to be a staple. Like any game that you got, I remember back in the day opening a new game and the first thing I would do before I would even pop the disc in, I would break out the manual and I would just read it cover to cover. And I feel like that's kind of lost in translation these days, especially when you go back and look at those older games, because nobody knows to do that anymore.
It's unreal. It's gotten so bad. It's not only are there no menus in the boxes. You open up the box, there's no menu. You put in the game, okay. I go to the help screen, and this is, I don't know which NHL this is. This might be, 1920 or something. You go to the help screen, and when you click help, it's just a single line of text on the page that says, go to ea.com/NHL for help. Like, that's their help menu. They don't tell you anything about the game beyond, all right, just go to the website.
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
It's almost numbing how there's just this assumption, right, that the consumer knows how to absorb the product in a way that they never would have assumed 30 years ago.
And it's honestly kind of crazy when you think about when I tried to introduce my parents to games, especially like my dad always played games, but my mom is kind of dabbling a little bit now. And the things that we take for granted as people who have been immersed in the gaming culture for so long, like we just know there are certain things, like you put a controller in front of me and you put a game in and I kind of know how to move around without even having to read any instructions, but not everybody is going to have that insight and experience. So it's very wild to me that the help options in games these days are very limited.
Yeah, well, I've experienced, which also, by the way, I never thought ET was going to be the answer to this question. So, props, I guess, for surprising me. Yeah, I am one of the people I've never played it, but I've heard so often that it's the worst game of all time. I've seen people play it. It looks like an Atari
philosopher,
game.
Don't believe the hype.
Right, but yeah, I've experienced this too, and I don't know if you guys have, but I used to play this game for the Nintendo 64 called Jet Force Gemini, which was one of the first shooters I ever played, and was obsessed with this game. I mean, poured so many hours into it. And then, I don't know, it had to be 4 or 5 years ago at this point, but obviously many years after I put that game down. And I'd played many shooters since with, Xbox 360 controllers and PlayStation controllers, all of that. And when you go back and try to play a shooter on an N64 controller with the one stick, it's so foreign. Like it feels like you're like, how did I do this when I was 8 years old? And how did I do it well and easily? And now going back to it, it's this weird, like, I don't know, some mental shift happens that you go back and you're like, oh my goodness.
I actually had to do this recently. This is a segue, and apologies for the plug, but I'm a writer and editor on a certain N64 guidebook that's coming out probably next year. And we split up the work. I had to play Hexen amongst other games for the book. And yeah, it is funny going back to those early Silicon graphics, the single analog, the bizarre N64 controller, and how foreign it looks when you first grab it. And then 6 months into working on the book, just how natural it felt again. And there's this bizarre learning curve to that particular accessory that just makes it, it's such a unique system. It was a really fun one to go back and to write on again and to sort of investigate, because it's such a weird, border straddling, not entirely sure what it wants to be system.
It's the controller is like just so bizarre. It's like Lovecraftian. There's three. You have two hands, right? But there's three places at which to hold the controller. It's just like when I look back at that controller now, I'm like, it doesn't make any sense. And you do, establish, like you said, if you go back to it, I'm sure if I went back now and I played it for a while, it would feel more natural, but there's still going to be a one section of the controller that you have to just move your hands all over the place to even use. It's
and most games just don't expect you to, right? Most games are going to use either the D-pad or the analog stick, or they're going to use the analog stick for play and the D-pad for like minor things like
menu options or something.
Yeah, macros or something.
So speaking of plugs, I'm going to give you another opportunity potentially. Since Winterion holds a studio title, are there any games that you have developed or that you're currently developing?
We want to. I made Winterion Game Studios originally in 2010. I've owned the company for over a decade, and it was originally designed because I did plan on making games, originally board games, before we moved on to digital stuff. This is before I decided to switch my major.
Oh, interesting.
I was actually considering making tabletop games. For 10 years, I was a high school dropout. And when I dropped out of high school, I got a job at a local game store. And the owners of the game store, who are still like family to this day, they're the godparents of my son. They were wonderful, and they're like, if you're going to keep working here, we think you should go to school. Why don't we get you into community college? You're too smart to be a high school dropout. Like 4 days into working that game store, I got hired on as the janitor. And 4 days into working there, the owner saw me. They had a LAN cafe set up at the store. And he saw me at one of the machines, and I had opened up the registry editor and was doing some hex editing because I think I wanted to get X-Wing versus TIE Fighter working, and there was this known bug with that particular version of X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, and I think I was just changing some D-word values or something to get the game to run correctly. And of course, the screen just looks like gibberish when he comes up there, and he's like, "Well, if you're doing this stuff, why are you my janitor?" So we came to an agreement where I'd be a janitor for a couple hours, and then I would do their website. And then when I was done working on their website for the day, I would go to, campus and I would take my classes or whatever. They kind of got me back on that path, to which I'm eternally grateful. But it also created a love for games for me, the tabletop medium especially, because we sold them, it was the store with every type of game was the tagline. They sold everything from Warhammer miniatures to comic books, board games, collectible card games, RPG stuff, historical war games, the gamut. It was kind of a mecca for gaming. We would have Games Workshop employees would come from the UK over to the US, and they would come to our store to show investors an example of what it's like for like their third party stores. It was a wonderful place to work.
What's your favorite board game? I'm a board game aficionado myself, and I did not know that you were. What's your favorite? I know it's on the spot question. That wasn't one you could prepare for, and there's a billion games, but
one that I am usually excited to break out on any given opportunity. I've enjoyed recently Sagrada, which is a 4-player board game.
I love Sagrada.
Building, right? Stained glass. Splendor is always fun to play. Although I find playing Splendor without the patrons at the top is a little more interesting to me. I don't know, they're a little broken. What else? It is always fun I have a group of friends that we like to play more complicated board games. Sometimes we'll fire up Battlestar Galactica.
Yep, played that one once.
I'm not a huge fan of the series necessarily, but the game is really wonderfully designed. Older stuff, I don't mind going back and playing terrible things like Life and Monopoly or...
Yeah. There's a character to those that, it's, I don't know, Monopoly frustrates me to no end, but there's nothing like Monopoly. It's why it has that staying power.
Yeah, Monopoly is actually, I think, the most recent game we played for the channel. I got the pleasure of finally, I should have done it a decade sooner. I got to write an article for retroware.com. And I love John D. and Lance and the guys that stood that up all those years ago. And I consider a lot of those retroware people friends. And I did an article on a guy who was a doctor out in Winfield, Kansas, Don Philip Gibson. And he was, he delivered kids. He was a church organist. To him, making games was an afterthought, but he could not afford the software you would need in a doctor's office to keep track of patients. So he wanted to teach himself to program. And he taught himself to program by making Monopoly, because Monopoly has very well understood rules. It's fun to him anyway. And if you can make that, then that was how he was going to teach himself Borland Turbo Pascal. And his Monopoly, his version of Monopoly, he released it on old bulletin board systems, pre-World Wide Web. And it was so popular, thousands and thousands of people were downloading it. It was getting spread to all sorts of
It was just
DDFs.
to listen to the dice rattle noise.
Right, that dice rattle noise. You know exactly the version I'm talking about, right? And so it was such a popular version of Monopoly. He passed away, unfortunately. I wrote the article about him posthumously. I had the chance to talk with him a couple times, a couple years before he passed. But he had so many fan letters. He had like hundreds and hundreds of fan letters piled up from people that wrote in thanking him. He had one from Steve Martin, who said, like, yeah, we love playing it, between takes on set. Like, we'll have a Monopoly game going, and we'll go back to the machine and play it, and then go back and like do a take. The Parker brothers actually sent him a cease and desist, so he had to stop releasing and making versions of it. But by then, I mean, it's the internet. It was out there. The game was kind of, to this day, it's still a thing. So
yeah, everything on the internet is forever.
Everything on the internet is forever for now.
Very true.
So getting back to video games, we've seen a lot of advancements in gaming lately, both in terms of hardware capabilities and innovative gameplay. Where do you think the future of games and game design is headed?
A lot of people answer this with VR. I don't have the same feeling when it comes to VR. And it's not for the reason you would think. It's more that in the same way that motion gaming was amazing and that the Wii was a super important system and it helped re-democratize the living room, that it got your grandparents to play again in a way that you hadn't been able to for forever, because everything past like the Atari or past the NES was just too intimidating. My grandmother was an Unreal Tetris and Dr. Mario player, but she never touched anything past the NES. She briefly had a PlayStation, but she didn't really play it much. And the Wii, she never had one, but I feel like the Wii is something that brought people back together. Virtual reality is really good at doing certain things. I think where it succeeds the most right now is anything that does not expect you to move. I went on a VR tour of Machu Picchu that was absolutely gorgeous. It was at Microsoft headquarters. We put the headset on and it was beautiful. It was surreal. It was a lot of fun to take that tour. I think where VR really is exciting and succeeds is things like witnessing locations or Imagine buying courtside seats, right? Let's say your favorite team, I don't know. I'm just going to say the Knicks, whatever, because, courtside at Madison Square Garden.
Mhm.
Let's say they can only seat 20,000 people in there. Okay, but what if they have the bandwidth and high enough resolution cameras that they can sell virtual courtside seats for $100 a pop and virtual seats for $25 a pop? So once they sell out, maybe they get an additional 5,000, 10,000 people watching in VR, and you get the sound of the experience of being there in your VR headset, the feeling of sitting, say, in the 200 section, or the feeling of sitting courtside and being able to turn left and turn right and follow the action the way you want to follow it. And the experience of being there when you can't otherwise be there. I'm thinking special events, sporting events, concerts, a lot of these experiences that right now are really hard for people to go to anyway, because waves arms outside the door. There's an opportunity there, and VR can fill a really wonderful space in the event genre. I was originally more excited for augmented reality when it came to gaming, and I think Pokemon Go was a step in the direction of where games could go with that sort of uniting the real world space in games. And I think mobile, just because the pervasiveness of mobile, is still the biggest opportunity space to do more interesting things or different things. So I feel like the innovation statistically is more likely to come from there. Where am I more excited to see things? Because I do think the future of games and game design, for better or worse, is going to be companies who make prestige projects on PC or on console that win awards or that are fun or popular for a segment of the population, that are financed by mobile games, that are financed by elaborate Skinner boxes. I think right now the industry is kind of in a bad place where it's releasing some good stuff and it's releasing some really, really sinister stuff. And unfortunately, the sinister stuff is paying for everything else. Best Buy would have gone out of business 10 years ago if not for cell phones. Like, every department in Best Buy is eating itself, like taking a loss, except for Best Buy Mobile. Best Buy Mobile is floating Best Buy at this point. Cell phones are so expensive, so pervasive, so inundated in modern life that, just statistically speaking, it sucks, but that's where it's going to come from. Like, the next thing that's going to come is going to come from that space.
Well, and speaking of the Best Buy thing, like, cell phones are also, specifically iPhones, and I'm an iPhone user, but like, they're also status symbols. Like, people who bought the iPhone 12 will go out next year and buy the iPhone 13 because it's the iPhone 13. So like, it's, thinking back to Pokemon Go too, I mean, that was nothing short of a phenomenon. I'll never forget the summer that Pokemon Go came out, because we
achieved world peace that summer.
It was
the calm before the storm.
It was the single thing, like, everybody was doing it. Like, I was one of the only people on Earth. I'm not a Pokemon fan, so I was one of the only people on Earth, I felt like, who wasn't just walking around at night.
You're not alone. I saw it happening on campus, but I am just a little outside that generation. So the original Pokemon came out, North America, 97, 98?
Something like that, yeah.
Right? And so, okay, whatever it was, I think I remember right around that time that it came out, and I was interested in, I want to say, Final Fantasy Tactics. And I just compared the two experiences. And one, as good as it might have been, portrayed itself so childishly, right? It was a Saturday morning cartoon. It was it was something that really looked like it appealed to kids. And I was just slightly too old to want to do it. And I feel like if I'd been 2 years younger, 3 years younger, I would have been 100% on board.
Well, even, I mean, the main character, like the whole story in the game was you turned 10 years old and you could go out in the world. And I feel like if you were skewing older, even having that be like the kind of beginning of the story for the game, you would have been like, oh, I'm a little bit too old for this.
It's true. How a game sells itself is so,
he's still 10.
Well, we're all 10 in some way, shape, or form.
Pokemon's interesting that way, because the two of the three hosts here are still huge Pokemon fans. They've theoretically, you would outgrow it at some point, right? But it doesn't work that way with Pokemon.
Nobody
Clearly
ever really outgrows there's a reason nostalgia is such a powerful tool. Like, no one ever really outgrows the things they love when they're kids. There are times in your life where you put it on the shelf, and there's times in your life where you dust it.
And honestly, I mean, I think we're positioned in today's day and age probably in previous generations, it was always like, oh, you hit a certain age and you had to shelve the childish stuff and you were kind of looked down upon and you needed to grow up. But I feel like we're in a very unique position in today's society where that kind of stuff is not frowned upon anymore. You know, like it's acceptable to continue to enjoy the things you enjoy and not feel bad about it. And I feel like that's kind of helped Pokemon's longevity. And especially in our case, like I have no qualms about playing the game and pretending like I'm 10 years old going on a mission again.
Well, and it's also, I think Daniel said much earlier in the interview that like gaming culture is not counterculture anymore. And I think that like feeds into being a nerd is cool now. Like that's why we have this podcast, to some extent.
Yeah, the
right?
losers
Because
play sports.
Nerd culture is now.
I like sports too, though.
Nerd culture is now like mainstream culture, and so I think that also feeds into what you're describing.
Yeah, if I had my way, I would still be playing hockey twice a week.
Okay.
Well, let's talk about root beer.
So you identify as a root beer expert on your Twitter. Is there a story behind that?
I think it's a short one. Do you know the Epic of Gilgamesh?
Yeah.
The name rings a faint
So
bell.
the very end of Gilgamesh, like Gilgamesh is, check me out, I am the greatest human of all time. Now I want to be a god. And so he goes to the island of gods, and there's an old dude on the island of gods, and he's like, hey, Gilgamesh, you want to be god? Cool. First thing you have to do is stay awake for a week. If you can stay awake for a week, we'll go from there. Gilgamesh passes out a few days later and is like, well, I guess I have to settle for being the greatest human ever. Sails off the island, the end. Kind of anticlimactic, admittedly. I don't think it would have focus grouped well. Fast forward to the early 1990s, a young Daniel Greenberg and his friends acquire Secret of Mana and a multi-tap. At the same time, we have these things. Barq's Root Beer is making its debut as being the Coca-Cola company has purchased Barq's Root Beer. I'm instantly hooked. It's got caffeine. It's marketed as, Barq's has bite. So there I am, young, with my best friends, summer break at our house in the middle of the woods, middle of nowhere. All you can do is just play around the house or play video games. And every day we'd play, and every night we would wait for the parents to go to sleep. When they were asleep, we would sneak downstairs, fire up Secret of Mana with the multi-tap, and play it straight to dawn, sneak back upstairs, quote unquote, go back to sleep. We kept doing this for days and days until we started acting kind of loopy. And I think my stepdad caught on and was like, oh my God, you guys are going to kill yourself. Go to bed. But I do think, and I'd have to, I don't know, maybe when I die and whatever afterlife awaits me, they'll let me go back and check the tape to see if I did or not. I think we outlasted Gilgamesh. I'm not positive we went to a week, because I've read studies that say if you actually stay up like a week straight, you start to have like some serious hallucinations and other problems, and it does like permanent damage. And I'd like to think that I'm not that addled. So I don't know that we necessarily stayed up a week, but I know we stayed up definitely longer than Gilgamesh did.
And thanks to Barq's Root Beer.
Yeah. And so, root beer is one of those things that I kind of attached to and I enjoyed, and I've enjoyed drinking for decades. Some of it is I enjoy when people like things and people study things and people get into things. You have cicerones for beer. You have sommeliers for wine. You don't really have a cool word for a root beer expert. So I kind of have to go with the verbose version of it. Also, I don't drink. Just speaking on like a personal level, I have had multiple family members go through like very challenging experiences with alcohol. So I know like I've got a genetic disposition to it. So I try to avoid it. I'm also not a fan of drinking it. So, you kind of had to, what's my parallel? What's the drink that I'm going to get invested in and learn more about and study? And there's something so quintessentially American about root beer. Its history first being sold in the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia by Charles Hires. And 100 years later, in 1976, sassafras, the FDA determines that that's carcinogenic and you can't use it anymore. And all of the different brands that have come and gone, and root beer's place in drinks as sort of this, granddaddy of pops or sodas, depending on where you live. And, how it's been perceived over the years. It's just something I enjoy.
By the way, the term for a root beer aficionado should be a sassafrasian, in my opinion.
It's not bad. We can workshop it. It's not bad. It's a good start.
So what's your favorite brand of root beer right now on this day?
So if I just have to go to the store and grab something, it's still a Barq's. And this is one of the key things about root beer is one of the first kind of diversions, branches that root beer has is it's either trying to be sweet or it's trying to be spicy. A sweet root beer is something that's going to lean on like honey, vanilla, mint. These are your A and W's. Delicious, but it's a dessert root beer. Barks goes the other direction. It has a spice blend. The caffeine helps a little bit. The carbonation helps a little bit, but it's trying to be a spicy root beer. I was on another podcast. I'm going to plug somebody else's podcast here. PD's Power Hour. She and I talked about root beer for a long time, and we had a couple root beers because her show is all about different drinks. I think we had Maine Root, which is definitely sort of like a spicy root beer, and Hank's, which is very much like drinking a cookie. And root beer can vary so wildly in that respect.
I'm curious your
There's
opinion
lots-
of Dr. Pepper. Just as a
I like Dr. Pepper. I think Dr. Pepper is perfectly good. I will find myself on a regular basis. I have a basement fridge, and we call the basement fridge Bessie. The Bessie has been named as such because when I was a kid, we always had extra milk in the basement fridge. That's why it got named Bessie, right? You go down to Bessie and get some milk. However, as I took over more and more of the buying decisions as I became an adult, as it became my own house and my own Bessie in the basement, it became an opportunity to basically have a soda machine in the house. I go down there and there's like a dozen different things. It's very common for me to have root beer, Dr. Pepper, some cola, some cherry cola, just a variety of options. No, I think Dr. Pepper's delicious. I know it's got sort of that Texas Southern thing going for it. And there's always sort of that Coke Dr. Pepper rivalry in the Deep South, but I think it's perfectly good. It's its own thing. It's not really root beer. It's 23 flavors, 22 of them are prune, but it's still good.
So this is a kind of final question, something that we usually ask all of the guests on our show. And outside of, the ability to go almost a week without sleep, if you were a real life superhero, what power would you want to have?
Oh, gosh. Just speaking, I guess, in terms of what's going to do the least damage to the world around me. Because so many superpowers, the problem is always the destabilizing nature of it, right? What does it mean to the world to see somebody fly? What does it mean to the world to see someone who is invulnerable or super strong or all those things, right? You think about sort of the big geopolitical consequences of those things. And, what superpower can you have that will like make your life better or make other people's lives better without necessarily destabilizing the planet?
Mm-hmm.
I've always been a fan of like precognition, pretercognition, the people that like just have a little bit of can kind of see what's just a little bit ahead. What was it? Morning Edition, where the guy gets the paper and it's tomorrow's news. So he can just he's still a person. He can just do something to help it because he has an inkling of what's going to happen. But, what he's doing isn't necessarily going to, turn the world upside down. Cassandra, going back to, Helen and Cassandra, the ability to see the future, but nobody believes you necessarily. I think there's something cool to having that short-term cognitive ability. I think it would be fun to, in some ways, it's got to be selected. I guess the super part of the superpower is being able to pick what I do and don't see the future of. I would hate to like sit down to a Caps game and already know how it's going to end.
Yeah, that would kind of ruin
right.
sports.
Right?
Sure.
Yeah, there's certain things it would absolutely ruin. But I think it would be great to like, if I go to the store, are they going to have what I want? Go to the grocery store. Are they going to have the root beer I want? Oh, they're not going to have it. They're out.
So you're talking seeing like parallel paths?
Yeah.
Like if you do this, this is going to happen. This.
Exactly. Give me the short-term, simple, like game facts version of things, right? Okay, well, maybe I should. So the weather says it's going to be blustery, but it's actually going to be nice this afternoon, despite what the weather report says. So I'm going to plan to take a walk this afternoon.
You'll be a very quick millionaire with your, if I pick this circle, then this is going to happen.
I mean, it could. Yeah, I guess there's always the risk of the corruption that comes from future sight, right? I would like to think my better angels would take, hold there, but you never know.
But then you'll donate it to charity. There you go.
That's what they all tell themselves. I'll be honest. I am scared so much. I was telling my family this. If I ever won the lottery, I don't think I'd ever tell anyone. And I'd be very careful about what states I play the lottery in, because there are certain states that you can win anonymously. You can claim your winnings without them announcing that you won. I don't think I'd ever want anyone knowing I won the lottery. I would hate to see what that would do to my personal and like friend relationship. Right? You imagine just how bad that could get.
you always hear stories about that too. People win the lottery and like their lives are ruined. And yeah, I think the part of me that, wants/needs money is like, no way. If I won the lottery, everything would be good. But like, there's just so many documented cases of that yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you that winning anonymously is almost certainly better.
I just don't know how my favorite hobbies would make me go broke or something, just because I don't know how you blow all your money in sweatpants and Netflix.
It's not you. It's not you. It's everyone else. That's the thing.
People will come to you and they know you have a certain amount of money, so then it influences their behavior towards you, etc. I think that's what it is.
Just give me a slightly colder root beer, a slightly nicer TV, and a few more minutes a day to enjoy the thing I love.
Yeah, just kind of like, it gives you, I think, the power to enjoy the good things in life if you can just keep it under wraps.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us here. Obviously, a lot of insight was bestowed upon us and our listeners, so we thank you. Anything else you want to let our listeners know about? Plug, parting thoughts?
Yeah, sure.
The floor is yours.
So I'm always happy to get into these discussions. I love doing it. I'm a teacher. That's kind of what we do. You mentioned Twitter. You can always find me online at Winterion. Our show, Ion Gaming, is on YouTube at watch.winterion.com. If you are interested in learning how to make games, George Mason University is located in Fairfax, Virginia. You can learn more about us at gmu.edu. And finally, the holiday season's kind of coming up here. So just want to wish everyone a terrific end of 2021 and hopefully a much better 2022.
I mean, it has to be, right? Like at this point, the arrow's got to point up at some point.
I don't know. I don't have the superpower.
Right. That's true. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks again, Daniel. Thanks to all the listeners. Thanks to anyone who leaves us a review on Apple Podcasts. Talk to us about anything we talked about on the show today. Daniel also mentioned his Twitter handle earlier in the episode. You can reach out to him as well. So, yeah, we'll see you next week. Thanks for stopping by.